Sergeant Tina T.J. Jacobs was used to impossible odds. She was the deadliest Delta Force commander the Army had ever produced, a woman whose service record shimmered with classified operations and improbable victories. But as she braked her matte bake SUV on the outskirts of Granite Falls, she had no idea that this small American town hid a corruption so entrenched it made enemy territory seem welcoming by comparison. Here, the uniform wasn't worn with pride. It was wielded like a weapon. And while TJ had wrestled insurgents in faraway deserts, nothing could have prepared her for the battle she was about to fight on American soil. Because when they slapped the cuffs on her, they thought they'd bagged another easy target. They had no clue they'd just arrested the one soldier who could bring their whole operation down. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Sergeant Tina T.J. Jacobs had driven countless miles across unfamiliar territories in her deployments, from scorching deserts to mountainous hideouts, each location more hostile than the last. But the silent tension she felt upon entering Granite Falls, population 12,500, somehow rivaled all of them. It was an unassuming place in America's heartland, a single stretch of main road dotted with wooden storefronts and a low-rise courthouse with chipped paint. The wide, empty streets spoke of slow days, but the stares she received from a few locals, silent as shadows, suggested something simmering beneath the surface. She'd decided to take this route back to Fort McKenna on a whim, craving a less crowded path. As soon as she saw the Granite Falls sign, she felt a chill. Her instincts had never lied before. The first red flag was the single police cruiser trailing her at a careful distance, its headlights creeping into her rearview mirror. TJ maintained the speed limit, her posture composed. With her calm but hyper-alert gaze, she tracked the cruiser's slow approach as it sped up momentarily, then dropped back. A predator circling a perceived prey. She couldn't pin down the reason. Maybe it was her out-of-state plates. Maybe they clocked her skin color through the window. Maybe the tinted windows of her SUV were enough to make them suspicious. Finally, those dreaded red and blue lights flickered, and TJ pulled over onto the dusty shoulder. The cruiser glided behind her. She had been in firefights more times than she cared to count, but this moment, on a quiet American highway, made her heart pound in a way she hadn't felt since her first operation overseas. A large, broad officer with a buzz cut and a smug expression approached. His name tag read, Adams. Behind him, a shorter officer with eyes like polished stone, Officer Niles, hung back near the cruiser. Lessons in registration, Adams barked, ignoring the everyday courtesy cops typically used. TJ handed them over without a word, hoping not to escalate. She'd lived through intense de-escalation training, but none of that was about to matter if these officers had already made up their minds. "Ma'am," Adams said, peering through the window. "Step out of the vehicle." "Is there an issue, officer?" Her tone remained level, her eyes focused. "Plenty of issues," Adams snorted. "License plates don't match the description on file. Could be stolen for all we know. Out of state, tinted windows. Makes me wonder..." "What?" "You're hiding." TJ stiffened. She knew for a fact her registration was in order, her plates legitimate. She willed herself to remain calm. An outburst wouldn't help. She stepped out, her every move deliberate. The late afternoon sun cast an orange glow on the deserted road. "Place your hands on the hood," Adams said. She did. The hood still radiated warmth from her drive. In her peripheral vision, she saw Niles circle around to open her back door, rummaging through her possessions without so much as a request for consent. TJ felt her pulse spike. This was all wrong. But she needed to see what they were after. "That's a suspicious bag," Niles said, extracting a black duffel from the back seat. "It's my gear," TJ said, her voice even. "Army issue. I'm stationed at Fort McKenna." Adams's eyebrows flickered in mild surprise, or maybe annoyance. "You're military?" "Yes, Sergeant, Delta Force." He scowled. "We have a real patriot here, huh?" TJ caught Niles's subtle grin. Something told her they'd dealt with traveling passers-by before, and it never ended well for the traveler. Niles unzipped the duffel, rummaging past a neatly folded uniform and some training accessories. Then his hand re-emerged, holding a small plastic bag of white powder. Now, what do we have here? TJ's jaw clenched. That's not mine. Niles feigned a pitying sigh. It never is, right? Adams forcibly turned her around, snapping cold metal cuffs around her wrists. Possession with intent to distribute, I'm guessing. Let's see what the lab says. TJ breathed deeply to quell the surge of rage. She'd been in enough hot zones to know that reacting physically could seal her fate. But inside, the furnace of her fury roared. She had endured more than a decade of service, multiple tours, leading teams on covert missions behind enemy lines. She had stared down insurgents and not once allowed fear to control her. But this injustice on her home soil, felt like a betrayal of the very freedom she'd fought to protect. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser. The interior reeked of stale cigarettes. Niles tossed her duffel in the trunk and hopped into the driver's seat, while Adam slid behind the wheel. TJ, though handcuffed, managed to keep her bearing. Adams glanced back, studying her with an unsettling smugness. Delta Force, you said? Maybe you should have known better than to come through Granite Falls. Niles let out a short laugh. She'll learn. TJ's mind spun. She needed to keep track of every detail. Street names, times, badge numbers, anything that might help her unravel what was happening. Because something about this arrest felt routine for them, like they'd done it 100 times. The question was, how deep did it go? They drove into Granite Falls proper, a little cluster of buildings around a central square. The setting sun cast long shadows, stretching across an old courthouse made of red brick, the windows tinted black so no one could see inside. A police station stood next door, small but sturdy, bars on the windows. Inside the station, Adams marched TJ to a booking counter. A tired-looking desk sergeant with watery gray eyes typed lazily at a computer. A worn-out deputy rummaged through a stack of arrest files. Everything smelled of stale coffee, must, and a tinge of bleach. Incoming, Adams said, practically throwing TJ forward. The desk sergeant looked up. What do we have? Drug possession, Adams said. A real big-time stash. TJ inhaled quietly, noticing that the sergeant never even asked for an explanation from her. He simply began pulling out forms. So it was normal, then. Another day in Granite Falls. As the desk sergeant droned through booking questions, TJ scanned the station. Flickering fluorescent lights overhead, a corridor leading to holding cells, another corridor, labeled Offices and Evidence Room. She caught a glimpse of an office with the door cracked open. A man in a pressed suit, almost too nice for a small-town DA, she guessed, stood scanning a file. He had the presence of someone who commanded authority, but a certain cunning glint in his eye, possibly the district attorney or someone close. Adams roughly removed TJ's cuffs only to replace them with a different pair, linked to a metal chain attached to the floor near the booking desk. She felt the cold steel bite into her wrists. She forced herself to stay calm, to focus on next steps. Name? The desk sergeant said. Last name first. Her response was succinct. Jacobs, Tina. He typed slowly, asked standard booking questions. Then came the fingerprinting, the mandatory mugshot. TJ stared into the camera with her jaw set, her adrenaline pumping, her mind racing. When Adams nudged her with the side of his baton, she refused to flinch. She met his gaze directly. She might be under arrest, but she wasn't broken. Quit trying to act tough, he muttered. In here, you do what we say. No one's coming to save you. He had no idea who she was, beyond just Delta Force. He didn't understand the resources at her disposal, the loyalty of soldiers she'd once commanded, or the significance of her direct ties to key figures at the Pentagon. She wasn't just any soldier. She was a recognized hero, albeit of classified feats. But as far as Adams and Niles were concerned, they had their typical out-of-town suspect, who would either plead out or rot in their cells. They shoved TJ into a holding cell. Concrete walls, a lone bench, dim overhead lighting. A second occupant, a middle-aged black man, wearing clothes that seemed too nice for a typical petty criminal, looked up from where he sat. His face bore bruises, and his posture spoke of hopelessness. She offered a nod. "You okay?" He shook his head, voice trembling. "Name's Leonard. I was just driving through after a business trip. They pulled me over for a busted taillight. Next thing I know, they found drugs in my trunk. I don't even do aspirin." TJ sat on the bench. "They do this often?" He huffed a bitter laugh. "From what I hear, all the time. Good luck getting out, though. The DA and half this station are in on it. I asked for a lawyer, been waiting 2 days. No phone call allowed. They say system's down or the phone's broken." Her jaw tightened. The Constitution guaranteed a right to an attorney, a phone call, due process. But it seemed Granite Falls had its own set of rules. Leonard lowered his voice to a whisper. "They keep trying to pressure me to sign a confession. If I do, they say maybe I can get probation. Otherwise, they threaten 10 years in prison." "Has anyone talked about the local judge?" TJ asked quietly. Leonard nodded. "Judge Hawthorne, known to hand out maximum sentences. Something about private prison contracts. People vanish after sentencing." Everything inside TJ tightened. This wasn't just a pair of rogue cops planting evidence for an easy arrest. It sounded like a system, one that turned innocent travelers into commodities for private prisons, with all the players in place. Corrupt cops, a complicit DA, a judge who rubber-stamped convictions, each step monetizing the destruction of lives. She clasped her hands. She had to figure out how to get word out. She had connections far beyond this backwater station. The question was, how? Time warped in the holding cell. An hour might have passed, or several. Eventually, the heavy thud of boots announced visitors. Adams appeared, along with another officer TJ hadn't seen before. Tall, gaunt, with eyes like a hawk. His name tag read Sykes. They uncuffed TJ from the bench and marched her down the hall. She passed by a row of offices, glimpsed the DA's door with the name Grant Holloway stenciled in gold, so that was the well-dressed man she'd spotted earlier. They led her into a small interrogation room with a flickering overhead light and a camera in the corner. Or maybe it was just a prop. She suspected they conveniently lost footage when needed. Sykes folded his arms, leaning against the wall. Adams loomed over her. "Sergeant Jacobs," he began, his tone slick with false civility. "We ran your plates. Seems legit after all, but that doesn't negate the little baggie of contraband we found." She held his gaze. "It's not mine." Adams made a dismissive gesture. "Of course you'd say that. Now, we have an easy way out here. You sign a statement admitting you were transporting narcotics. First offense, you might get parole. Resist, and you'll face the full hammer of the law in Granite Falls." She steadied herself. "I'm not signing anything. I want my lawyer, and I want to call my CO." Sykes clucked his tongue. "Now, see, that's not how it works around here. We got a special system in place. Sign, and we can all move on with our lives." In the momentary silence, she could almost hear the hum of her own anger. Delta Force training hammered one principle into her mind: adapt, observe, and counterattack. She had to find a crack in their system. Adams sighed, feigning regret. "You want to do this the hard way? Fine, but let me warn you, our DA, he doesn't lose. He ensures every detail is stacked. You'll do years in a federal facility." TJ felt a flash of red-hot fury. She'd never run from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. "I've endured far worse threats than you can imagine. I'm not signing any fabricated confession." Her defiance made Adams's face flush. He leaned down, almost nose to nose with her. "You can't out-tough the system, Sergeant. Don't let that fancy uniform fool you." Sykes gave a thin smile. "We'll give you some time to think. Maybe a night in a real cell will change your mind." They cuffed her again and dragged her out. As she exited, she caught a glance of DA Holloway in the hallway, talking to a local judge in plain clothes. Must be Hawthorne. They paused their conversation to watch TJ pass, eyes cold with disinterest. A wave of uneasy recognition hit her. These men had done this so often, there wasn't a shred of doubt or conscience left in them. She spent the night in a single cell, reminiscent of some of the Spartan accommodations in her deployments, minus the entire unlawful arrest factor. Sleep eluded her. Her mind churned through possible ways to contact someone outside. Her phone had been confiscated. The station's phone was broken. She needed a friendly face, a single ally. Morning brought the smell of weak coffee and stale donuts from somewhere in the station. Eventually, an officer she hadn't met, Officer Keller, a younger woman with hesitant eyes, walked by the cells, checking a roster. TJ rose quietly, stepping to the bars. "Officer Keller," she murmured, her tone respectful but urgent. Keller stiffened. "What?" TJ eyed her carefully. "I need to make a phone call. Legally, you know I'm entitled to that." Keller broke eye contact. "I don't handle that." Something about her indicated she wasn't fully comfortable with this system. TJ pressed, keeping her voice low, non-accusatory. "You must have joined the force to serve justice, right?" That made Keller's lips press together. "I have orders, Sergeant. I can't help you." And yet, there was a tremor of uncertainty in her tone. TJ recognized a moral conflict, reminiscent of young recruits overseas who questioned questionable orders. "When you lay your head down at night," TJ said quietly, "can you live with enabling this? Planting evidence, forging confessions?" Keller glanced around, fear sparking in her eyes, then strode away, leaving TJ with no confirmation. But the seed was planted. By mid-morning, the air in the station turned tense. Something was happening. Officers dashed around with phones pressed to their ears or barked orders to subordinates. TJ caught snatches of conversation from her cell. Words like funding, quota, transport, prison intake. When Sykes finally appeared, he had a triumphant grin. "Well, good news, Sergeant. We're expediting your court hearing." She forced a smirk. "Why the rush?" "Oh, we've got a judge available. Let's get this over with. I'm sure you'll appreciate a quick resolution." Her stomach twisted. A quick resolution usually meant no time to mount a defense. No time to challenge the planted evidence. Sure enough, they hustled her into an old courthouse next door, the corridors lined with portraits of previous judges. Judge Hawthorne, a broad-shouldered man with a southern drawl, sat behind the bench. He drummed his fingers on the wooden surface impatiently. The hearing was a sham from the start. DA Holloway read off the charges: possession of narcotics with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, reckless driving. Random charges tacked on for good measure. TJ had no lawyer present. The judge waved away her request for representation, claiming the public defender's schedule was booked solid for weeks. In less than 20 minutes, Hawthorne declared there was enough evidence to proceed with an official trial, but until that day came, TJ would remain in custody. No bail, no release. He gave her an almost bored look. "You're a flight risk, Ms. Jacobs. Out-of-state plates, suspicious behavior. Court date is set for next month. This hearing is adjourned." They dragged her out. Back in the station, they placed her in a different holding area. This time, a bigger cell, presumably for longer stays. Leonard, the other detainee, had vanished. She feared the worst. Noon passed, and a new wave of officers came in for shifts. Then, in late afternoon, an unexpected face appeared at her cell door. It was Officer Keller again, a ring of keys in her hand. She cast a furtive glance at the nearby camera, though it might have just been an empty box. "You get one phone call," she whispered. Hope lit up in TJ's chest. "Thank you." Keller's eyes darted. "Don't thank me. Just make it quick. Chief's out on a call. The DA's at lunch. They'll kill me if they find out." She led TJ down a hallway to a small alcove with an outdated landline phone. Keller handed it over, her fingers trembling. "I'll stand guard." TJ dialed from memory. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then came a gruff voice. "Colonel Beckman speaking." Relief flooded her. Colonel Beckman had been her CO in Delta Force for years. She kept her voice low. "Sir, it's Sergeant Jacobs. I'm in trouble. Granite Falls, some corrupt cops. They planted drugs on me. The judge is in on it. I need help." Silence on the other end. Then a carefully measured response. "Sergeant, are you physically safe?" "For now," she said, glancing at Keller's tense posture. "But they're forcing confessions. They used a sham hearing to deny me bail. This entire place is dirty." Beckman exhaled sharply. "Hang tight. I'll contact JAG and possibly the FBI. We'll find a legal way in. You're a high-value operator, Jacobs. They messed with the wrong soldier. Understand me? Don't sign anything." Adams's voice thundered from down the hall. "Keller, what the hell are you doing?" Keller yanked the phone away. "Go!" she hissed, hauling TJ back to the cell. TJ's heart pounded. She'd gotten her message out. She just hoped Colonel Beckman could move fast enough. Adams stomped up, suspicion etched on his face. "What's going on?" Keller kept her gaze down. "Nothing. Just moving the prisoner." He let out a low grunt. "Well, the prisoner can stay put. We got the DA coming in soon." His eyes narrowed at TJ. "Hope you've changed your mind about that confession." TJ said nothing, but a seed of hope took root in her chest. She had backup in the outside world now, someone with actual authority, not just a random lawyer. The question was whether the station's corruption ran so deep they'd block any external help. The next hours dragged on. She overheard bits of conversation. An ongoing directive that seemed to revolve around monthly arrest quotas, ties to a private prison contract that offered the department incentive bonuses for a consistent flow of inmates. Words like kickbacks and contracts surfaced, painting a grotesque picture. By dusk, the station doors opened to reveal a new figure. A tall man with immaculately groomed hair, wearing a suit that screamed Washington influence. The hush that fell over the precinct indicated he was either well known or had the kind of power that made everyone uneasy. He introduced himself to the desk sergeant quietly. TJ couldn't catch the entire exchange. Then the man made his way to the cell blocks, escorted by Adams. He paused in front of TJ's cell, hands clasped behind his back. "Sergeant Jacobs?" His voice carried the crisp accent of someone used to formal settings. "Name's Richard Helms, Department of Justice." Her eyes narrowed. She'd never heard of him. "You from D.C.? He nodded. "Correct. I was, let's say, informed by certain parties in the Pentagon that we have an unusual situation here." Adams's expression twitched. He forced a smile. "Ah, yes, we're fully cooperating. We found contraband in her possession. She's facing distribution charges." Helms glanced at him, unimpressed. "Of course. I'll need to see the arrest report, the chain of evidence, the body cam footage." Adams coughed. "Our body cams? Been having issues. Not sure they recorded properly." TJ bit back a grim laugh. "Of course." Helms offered a tight-lipped smile. "Is that so? Then we'll manage with the paperwork." He turned back to TJ. "Sergeant, are you being treated fairly?" The sheep didn't hesitate. "No, they've fabricated evidence. This whole department is corrupt." Adams tried to cut in. "Now hold on," but Helms raised a hand. "Officer, you can wait outside." Adams blinked in surprise, but complied, perhaps worried about crossing someone from the DOJ. Once he was gone, Helms leaned closer, voice dropping to a hush. "Colonel Beckman called in quite a few favors. We're here to investigate potential civil rights violations. However, local authorities are notoriously good at stalling. We need tangible proof." TJ clenched her fists around the bars. "They've locked up multiple people on false charges. Private prison pipeline. A judge in on it. The DA is the orchestrator. The entire station's complicit, except maybe one or two. I've heard them mention monthly quotas, forging confessions. They tried to get me to sign. I refused." Helms pressed his lips together. "I can't just bust you out without following procedure. But we might get a federal injunction if we prove systemic corruption. I'll push for a transfer to a neutral facility where you can await trial. That's the best I can do short term." Her chest tightened. She didn't want to remain locked up at all, but at least Helms's presence was a sign her chain of command had responded. "Any chance you can expedite?" "I'll do what I can." He slipped her a meaningful nod. "Stay strong and watch your back. This town is known for shutting down dissent, sometimes violently." She exhaled. "I've faced worse." Helms gave a small grin. "I believe you." For the next 2 days, Helms fluttered around the station, politely demanding documents, shaking hands with local officials, and chasing leads about potential corruption. Meanwhile, TJ languished in her cell. Occasionally, Keller stopped by to slip her half a sandwich or pass an encouraging word, always looking over her shoulder. Leon returned at one point, escorted by an officer. He had a sullen expression, and when TJ caught his eye, he mouthed, "They got me." She suspected he'd signed a confession. TJ felt her anger blaze anew. This place preyed on fear, on helplessness. Not everyone had Colonel Beckman or the Department of Justice on speed dial. Hundreds, maybe thousands, might have passed through Granite Falls, forced into confessions or slapped with draconian sentences. On the third morning, Helms rushed into the holding area, flanked by the DA, Holloway, and a scowling Adams. Helms wore a stern expression. "Sergeant Jacobs, I'm afraid the judge has denied my motion for a transfer. They claim you're a flight risk." Holloway smirked behind him. "We have to maintain local jurisdiction." A wave of frustration crashed through TJ. She kept her face impassive, but inside she felt a sting. Even the DOJ was being stonewalled. "We have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow," Helms continued, ignoring Holloway. "I'll be there, and I'll request release on personal recognizance." The DA inserted himself, "And I'll object, given the severity of the charges." TJ locked eyes with him. "You're playing a dangerous game, DA." His smirk twisted into something darker. "You have no idea how things work in this town. We've been doing this for years, Sergeant. You're just another mark." In the background, Helms tried to remain impartial, but TJ sensed his frustration. This system was well-oiled, fortified by local alliances. Late that evening, tension buzzed in the station's corridors. People shouted orders, phones rang non-stop, and officers scurried from one room to another. Something big was happening, though no one told TJ. As she dozed on the hard bunk, the jarring echo of boots jolted her awake. Niles and Sykes stood at her cell door, wearing grim expressions. "Get up," Niles ordered. She rose, heart pounding. "What's going on?" Sykes pulled out a set of shackles. "Judge Hawthorne authorized an immediate transfer to Clinton County Correctional. Your hearing's postponed. We can't keep you here." Postponed? She tried not to sound alarmed. "Helms said the hearing was tomorrow." Niles gave a mocking grin. "Plans change." They cuffed her wrists and ankles, chaining her so she could barely walk. Despite her best efforts to remain composed, panic flickered in her chest. If they moved her to a correctional facility with the same corrupt ties, would she just disappear? They led her outside into the humid night. A black van idled behind the station. The rear doors yawned open like the mouth of a beast. No insignia, no license plates she could see. Red flags flared in her mind. This didn't look like a normal prisoner transport. She spotted Adams near the driver's door, nervously glancing around. Something about his posture made her suspect this was off the books. A spike of adrenaline lanced through her. This might be the moment. They were going to vanish her the way they'd likely vanish so many others. "Move," Niles barked, shoving her forward. TJ gritted her teeth. She had to pick her moment carefully. With her ankles shackled, she had minimal mobility, but she'd trained in advanced combat for years, learning how to adapt to constraints. She let them push her into the van, feeling the cold metal floor beneath her. Adams slammed the doors. Darkness enveloped her. She heard the chain rattle as she tested her range of motion. If they were truly about to kill her or transfer her somewhere secret, her best chance might be during transit. She willed her breathing to remain steady. She mentally mapped out how she'd handle each officer if the chance presented itself. Sykes was tall but not bulky. A well-placed elbow strike could incapacitate him. Niles carried a sidearm. She had to neutralize him first. Adams was the wild card behind the wheel. The van's engine roared to life. She felt the vehicle lurch forward. Through a gap in the metal partition, she heard muffled conversation. Sykes' voice. "You sure we're good to do this?" DA said keep it quiet. "Niles will drive out to that old quarry. She tried to escape. We had no choice but to put her down." TJ's heart hammered in her chest. So it was a full-on assassination plan. Another life turned into a statistic. She forced herself to remain perfectly still, listening. They likely assumed the shackles rendered her harmless. They had no idea the extremes Delta Force training instilled. She counted the minutes. The van rattled over rough roads, presumably leaving Granite Falls. They'd probably chosen a remote quarry so no one would witness. She tested the chain between her wrists, searching for a weak link or a slight give. The metal was thick, but the pin connecting the cuffs to the chain felt cheap. If she could find a way to wedge the pin, the van slowed. Maybe they reached a turn. She braced, anticipating that at some point they'd stop, and they'd drag her out. That was her best moment. Sure enough, after another mile on bumpy terrain, the van screeched to a halt. Niles hopped out first. She heard muffled footsteps and the click of a sidearm. Her entire body tensed. The calm before battle. She might not survive, but she sure as hell wasn't going down without a fight. The rear doors flung open. Niles stood silhouetted by the van's interior light, pistol in hand. Sykes lingered behind him, his own weapon drawn. "End of the line," Niles sneered. "Come on out, Jacobs. Let's see that fancy Delta training." She shuffled forward, the shackles restricting her steps. They thought she was completely subdued. "Turn around," Sykes snapped. "We'll unchain your ankles so you can dig your own grave." He laughed, a dark, humorless bark. Niles hopped into the van, reached for the lock on her ankle cuffs. She seized that instant, rotating her hips. She used her left elbow to smash the side of his head. He yelped, toppling sideways. Sykes cursed, raising his weapon. But TJ lunged low, pivoting around Niles's collapsing body to place him between her and Sykes. The bullet Sykes fired lodged into the metal side of the van with a deafening clang. Sweat and adrenaline slicked her skin. She twisted her wrists. In the scuffle, the chain pin had come halfway loose. She yanked, hard. The pin snapped free, her wrists pulling apart, still cuffed but not connected by chain. Niles tried to scramble up. She delivered a savage knee strike to his face, ignoring the stab of pain from her partially shackled ankles. He crumpled. Sykes stepped back to get a clearer shot. She dove, gripping Niles's pistol hand. She tore the firearm free, but Sykes fired again. A bullet seared past her ear, and she felt the flash of heat. She whipped her elbow upward into Sykes's gut. He grunted, stumbled. With her newly freed hands, she hammered his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. She kicked it away, ignoring the protest in her ankles. Sykes swung wildly, smashing a fist into her shoulder. The blow ached, but she'd taken worse hits in training. She pivoted, hooking his leg from behind, sweeping him off balance. He crashed onto the gravel outside the van. Niles groaned, but he was out of the fight for the moment. TJ snatched the sidearm from near the floor, adrenaline surging. She barely recognized her own voice as she growled. "Stay down!" Sykes, furious, tried to scramble for his gun. She aimed the weapon at him, hands shaking from the intensity of the confrontation, but still steady enough to shoot if needed. "Don't," she warned. "Next shot won't miss." He froze, arms raised. She saw the hate in his eyes. Hate at being bested by a prisoner, especially a black woman he thought he could easily murder. She panted, quickly glancing around for Adams. But the driver was nowhere to be seen. The empty driver's seat suggested he might have run off or circled around. She had to move fast. Leaping from the van, she scanned the darkness. The old quarry stretched out in a moonlit expanse. A few large boulders dotted the perimeter. An abandoned shack sat on the far edge, thick bushes behind it. She heard footsteps. Adams, approaching from behind. She whirled, gun extended, finger off the trigger but ready. He paused, hands up, though fury twisted his features. "You're making a big mistake." She let out a mirthless laugh. "You were about to kill me. I think the mistake is all yours." "Drop it," he hissed, inching closer. She tracked his movement, angled so she could see Sykes in her peripheral. Niles lay still inside the van, maybe regaining consciousness. "I'll drop you first," she warned. He sneered. "Go ahead, Jacobs. Shoot a cop. See how that ends for you." Her heart pounded, but her training held her steady. She never wanted to kill a cop. But these men had left her no choice if they attacked again. Behind her, the gravel crunched. She spun just as Sykes lunged with a blade aimed at her back. She dodged, her sidearm discharging with a crack that echoed off the quarry walls. The bullet caught Sykes in the leg. He collapsed, howling in pain. Adams used that distraction to charge. She barely pivoted in time, but he tackled her to the ground, sending the gun skidding across the gravel. Pain detonated in her shoulder. He pinned her, hands around her throat. Stars flashed in her vision as she choked, gasping for air. Summoning every ounce of strength, she kneed him in the groin. He yelped, grip loosening. She slammed her cuffed wrists into the side of his head. He toppled off, cursing, and she scrambled to her feet. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead, but she forced herself upright, scanning for the pistol. Sykes was writhing, cursing a storm. Adams was on all fours, spitting gravel from his mouth. TJ spotted the gun near a small boulder. She lunged and scooped it up. Adams froze, eyes wild. "Don't move," she rasped, voice raw from being strangled. For a beat, the only sound was everyone's ragged breathing. Then the distant wail of a siren shattered the silence. Light beams flickered on the other side of the quarry. Reinforcements? She braced for more corrupt cops, but to her shock, she saw the black silhouette of a helicopter overhead, spotlight sweeping the area. Another set of lights from the dusty approach road, the rumble of an engine, a big SUV. She pressed herself against the van, gun tight in her grip, not sure if friend or foe was arriving. The SUV skidded to a stop, headlights illuminating the scene. Out stepped Colonel Beckman himself, clad in civilian clothes but wearing the determined face of someone who commanded respect. Beside him was Richard Helms, and right behind them, two more official vehicles roared up, FBI emblazoned on the sides. FBI agents burst out, weapons drawn, shouting orders. "Hands up! Don't move!" Sykes, pinned by the bullet wound, raised a trembling hand. Adams, still on the ground, slowly lifted his arms. TJ exhaled a breath of profound relief. Colonel Beckman rushed to her, ignoring the FBI's perimeter. His eyes flickered with alarm at the sight of her battered face, the shackles, the immediate chaos. "Sergeant, stand down. We got you." TJ swallowed hard, lowering the weapon. Her entire body shook from adrenaline. She allowed Beckman to gently remove the gun from her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice thick with concern. She gave a short nod, hardly believing the cavalry had arrived. "They were going to kill me, dump my body in the quarry." Helms stepped forward, an ashen expression. "We intercepted a tip. The DA tried to bury your hearing, then we realized no official transport was scheduled." He gestured at the FBI agents who were cuffing Adams and Sykes. "We suspected something off the books." A wave of gratitude nearly overwhelmed her. She slumped against the van, exhaustion soaking into her bones. Beckman signaled two FBI medics, who rushed up to assess her. As they applied first aid to her bruised shoulder and scuffed wrists, she caught a glimpse of Adams's face, twisted in panic. The same man who had been so smug, so certain of his power. Now he was the one cuffed. The next several hours were a whirlwind of statements, scene documentation, and official interviews. An FBI agent named Chase seemed to be leading the field operation, methodically collecting evidence from the van, the personal effects on Niles and Sykes, and the entire area. They took photos of the bullet holes, the tire tracks, the blood on the gravel from Sykes's wound. Colonel Beckman stayed close to TJ, ensuring she got medical attention and that her story was recorded accurately. Meanwhile, Helms orchestrated calls to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, pulling in more resources. By dawn, under the first pink tinge of daylight, news vans had gathered near the police station. Word had leaked of a massive corruption investigation in Granite Falls. The FBI had wasted no time in raiding the station. Photos of battered detainees, false arrest records, and suspicious financial ledgers poured out into the open. TJ, after a thorough checkup, found herself back in the station, but this time not in a cell. She stood in the main bullpen area, watching as FBI agents sealed boxes of evidence. The entire place was abuzz with shock and confusion. A handful of local officers, perhaps not deeply involved, looked pale and terrified of what they'd witnessed. She spotted Leonard, the man with the bruised face, stepping out of a cell with an FBI escort. Relief softened his features when he saw her, and he whispered, "Thank you." She realized her refusal to sign a confession, her phone call, and Colonel Beckman's subsequent involvement had triggered a chain reaction that might free dozens of innocents. An FBI official approached TJ. "Sergeant Jacobs, we'd like you to come with us to the county courthouse. We're filing immediate motions to dismiss your charges." She nodded, too tired to muster a grand sense of triumph yet. She just wanted to see this system crumble. Colonel Beckman accompanied her every step. On the short drive to the courthouse, he finally allowed himself a grim chuckle. "I got a call from a certain friend in the Army JAG. They were furious at hearing how you were treated. I told them if we found you dead, well," his expression darkened, "let's just say Granite Falls would be on the receiving end of some unstoppable legal wrath." TJ pressed her lips together. "Thank you for coming. I really thought they'd kill me out there." He nodded, sorrow in his eyes. America shouldn't be a place where a highly decorated soldier, anyone for that matter, fears being murdered by the people meant to protect us. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm sorry I had to drag you into this, sir." Beckman's face hardened. "Nonsense. You've risked your life for this country. If we can't protect you here, what does that say about us?" She reached across the seat, clasping his hand in a moment of raw gratitude. They arrived at the county courthouse to find the FBI had already cornered Judge Hawthorne in his chambers. The judge's eyes bulged with anger and fear as federal agents laid out evidence of conspiracy, bribery, and corruption. He'd been signing off on warrants and sentencing innocent travelers to feed a private prison system that gave him kickbacks. DA Holloway fared no better. Agents discovered offshore accounts in his name, bribe logs, and communications with private prison executives discussing monthly intakes. Holloway, once so smug, was now pale and trembling as he was read his rights. TJ observed from a distance as the FBI marched the judge and DA away in handcuffs. The entire spectacle felt surreal, as though she'd stepped into a movie about crooked officials finally toppled. Helms approached, brandishing a thick sheaf of papers. "It's official. All charges against you are dismissed with immediate effect. Also, we found the stash in the evidence locker labeled Routine Arrest 47, which matches the bag they claim was in your duffel." Her lips quirked in a bitter half-smile. "Routine, indeed. Thank you." He offered a polite nod. "You can head back to your unit, Sergeant. The FBI wants your testimony, though, so don't go too far." Colonel Beckman placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure every false arrest is overturned. The entire scam is under federal investigation." A swirl of relief, anger, and gratitude surged inside TJ. Lives had been ruined here. Some might never recover, but at least the machine was exposed. Within a week, the headlines screamed, "Corruption bust in small town. Military hero reveals police judicial scam." Major news networks broadcasted the shocking scale of the operation. Over 100 victims in Granite Falls alone, targeted for their demographics, forced into confessions, locked away to fill private prison quota. TJ found herself fielding calls from reporters, receiving messages from grateful families, and shaking hands with FBI officials who congratulated her bravery. She deflected the hero label, insisting she'd only done what was necessary to survive. During a press conference, the FBI publicly announced arrests of multiple officers, the local judge, the DA, and even some state-level politicians connected to the scheme. Warrants extended to private prison executives who had financed the operation for profit. Standing near Colonel Beckman, TJ listened as Helms laid out the grand conspiracy. She learned that Granite Falls was just one node in a web of corruption spanning multiple states, sheriffs, judges, and DAs all in on the take, funneling convicted individuals into privately owned facilities. The more prisoners they supplied, the bigger their kickbacks. She had to swallow hard, thinking of the hundreds, maybe thousands of unsuspecting travelers who never had a chance. Several weeks later, with the initial frenzy dying down, TJ found herself in a quiet moment outside her old training grounds at Fort McKenna. Dressed in civilian clothes, she stared at the horizon. The dry wind carried faint echoes of her specialized training days. Colonel Beckman approached, quietly. "You did well. Some of these people might still be rotting in private cells if you hadn't fought back." She exhaled. "I keep thinking about the ones who didn't make it. The ones who signed pleas, lost years of their lives, or got handed maximum sentences by that crooked judge." Beckman nodded, face grim. Justice is often slow, but now that the FBI's pulled the mask off, there's a real movement to fix it. She clenched her fists. I want to help, however I can. If there's a hearing, a trial, count me in. I'll testify, I'll stand in front of the Senate if needed. We have to make sure they can't rebuild this machine somewhere else. His lips curved into a proud, sly smile. That's exactly the determination we need. The Army's proud of you, Jacobs. She laughed wryly. Proud that I got arrested on false charges and nearly executed by dirty cops? Proud that you refused to break, he said gently. Proud that you exposed a ring of corruption that rotted the fabric of the justice system in that region. Proud that our Delta Force commander fought just as fiercely on American soil as overseas. She blinked back sudden emotion. I appreciate that, sir. When the first major trial began, for Judge Hawthorne, D.A. Holloway, and several officers, TJ took the stand. Cameras weren't allowed, but the courtroom overflowed with journalists and observers. She recounted her entire ordeal: the traffic stop, the planted drugs, the forced hearing, the attempted murder at the quarry. Each word landed like a hammer blow, the entire gallery bristling with indignation. Holloway stared at her with undisguised hatred. Hawthorne slumped, seemingly resigned to his fate. The officers, including Adams, Sykes, and Niles, all faced charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted murder. In cross-examination, a high-prized defense attorney tried to shake TJ, insinuating that her Delta Force background made her dangerously skilled and that she attacked the officers out of aggression. She gave a mirthless smile. I only attacked them when they tried to kill me in an illegal assassination attempt. Any soldier would defend their life under those circumstances. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge presiding over this trial was a federal judge from outside the state, someone with no ties to the local system. The defense attorney's attempts to paint her as an aggressor fell flat. By the end of the day, the evidence was damning. Recordings from the van's interior microphone system they forgot to disable, phone logs, the bag of drugs with no matching prints, bank transactions linking them to private prison executives. Even Officer Keller testified, tearfully describing how the station had coerced her to look the other way. The jury needed only 2 hours to deliberate. Guilty on nearly all counts. In the aftermath, state and federal authorities expanded the investigation to surrounding towns that shared the same private prison network. Granite Falls became a national symbol of the dangers of for-profit incarceration and systemic racism. Politicians took stands. Some demanded an end to private prisons altogether, others insisted on deeper oversight. Lawsuits piled up from victims seeking damages, entire legal teams mobilized to represent them pro bono. For TJ, a swirl of conflicting emotions accompanied the resolution. She'd done her part, testified, revealed the cracks in a corrupt system. But she couldn't forget the helplessness of being cuffed, hearing that damning mockery from Adams, the terror in that van at the quarry. She channeled that energy into something more. She began speaking at local and national events, military conferences, civil rights organizations, even gatherings of legal scholars, highlighting how easily justice could be corrupted if good people stayed silent. At times, the nightmares crept in. She'd see the muzzle of Sykes's gun or feel Adams's hands crushing her throat. In those moments, she'd remind herself, I made it out, and I brought them down. A year later, Granite Falls looked vastly different. The old station had been restaffed with an entirely new police force. FBI placards remained on the doors as the federal oversight continued. A significant wave of public defenders, civil rights lawyers, and volunteer attorneys had streamed in to re-examine past cases. Locals who once feared retribution found the courage to speak up about extortion, intimidation, and violence they'd suffered. TJ visited quietly, wearing civilian clothes and a baseball cap pulled low. She walked the same main street where she'd been followed by a cruiser. She saw new faces in police uniforms, some of them smiling at passers-by. The entire energy of the town felt lighter. Leonard, the man from the cell, recognized her on the sidewalk. He rushed over, a broad grin on his face. "Sergeant Jacobs!" I've been waiting to thank you properly. She returned his grin. I'm glad you're free and safe, Leonard. How have you been? He shrugged, eyes shining with relief. Took a while to get my name cleared, but the new DA apologized in person. The judge who replaced Hawthorne expunged my record. I'm moving forward. Her chest warmed. That's the best news. He nodded vigorously. People around here talk about you. It's like you came in, tore down the corrupt walls, and gave us a fighting chance. You're a hero. TJ swallowed. I appreciate the sentiment, but I was just... He held up a hand. You refused to be another victim. That gave the rest of us hope. A flicker of pride and sadness mingled in her chest. She patted his shoulder. Keep moving forward, Leonard. Don't let them define you by what happened. He thanked her again, then parted ways. TJ lingered for a moment, looking down the street at the new sign outside the station. Granite Falls Police Department, now under federal oversight. Committed to justice. She let out a slow breath. Maybe this place had a chance for redemption. Epilogue. Sitting on the porch of a ranch-style home near Fort McKenna, TJ watched the sun dip below the horizon. A swirling mix of orange and purple tinted the sky. She traced the lip of her coffee mug, reflecting on the whirlwind year. Her phone buzzed. The screen displayed Colonel Beckman's name. She picked up. Jacobs, you might want to turn on GNN. His tone was equal parts humor and seriousness. She clicked on the TV, flipping to the news channel. A reporter stood outside the state capitol. Behind her, a crowd of protesters held signs condemning private prisons and demanding justice system reform. The reporter announced that massive federal legislation was being introduced to curtail for-profit incarceration and hold local law enforcement to higher accountability standards. TJ's lips curved into a soft smile. Something big was shifting in America's conscience, spurred by a single traffic stop gone wrong in Granite Falls, culminating in a Delta Force commander refusing to be victimized. She turned off the TV and stepped outside, letting the quiet night air wash over her. Despite all she'd suffered, the arrest, the fear, the betrayal, she had emerged stronger. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while she felt a glimmer of hope for meaningful change. She reflected on the lessons she'd carry with her. One voice can spark an avalanche. Even if the system appears unstoppable, courage and resilience can trigger a cascade of exposure. Never underestimate the power of integrity. Corrupt forces rely on silence and intimidation. A single stand for truth can unravel their entire operation. Evil thrives in isolation. When good people, whether in law enforcement, the military, or government, connect and support each other, darkness loses its grip. The uniform isn't always a badge of honor. True honor lies in serving justice, not twisting it for profit. Accountability is the cornerstone of freedom. Without real checks and balances, any system can rot from within. She took in a deep breath of the warm twilight air. Her phone buzzed again. Another reporter, probably. She'd answer eventually, share her story once more if it meant pushing reform forward. For now, Sergeant Tina T.J. Jacobs, the deadliest Delta Force commander, simply stood on her porch, at peace with the knowledge that she'd not only defended her country abroad, but she'd also defended its ideals right here at home, reminding everyone that justice, when fought for, can triumph against even the deepest corruption. In a nation that prides itself on freedom and justice, it is easy to forget how fragile these ideals can become when corrupt individuals seize power. Tina T.J. Jacobs's harrowing experience serves as a stark reminder that vigilance is necessary, not just on foreign battlefields, but on our streets, in our courtrooms, and in every institution meant to protect us. The lessons her story imparts are universal and deeply relevant. Courage in the face of injustice, even a single individual who refuses to accept wrongdoing, can ignite systemic change. The power of allies, knowing when to call on help, and having networks that stand by you, can spell the difference between life and death. Corruption's breadth, It is never just one bad apple. Often, entire structures support unlawful practices. Uncovering them requires persistence, truth, and sometimes great sacrifice. Accountability and oversight, from local police forces to judges and politicians, every power must be balanced by watchdogs willing to investigate and penalize abuses. Human dignity, at its core, every system, military, police, legal, exists to serve people, not profit. When that truth is inverted, society itself begins to rot. And so, TJ's tale is not merely about one heroic individual. It is an ongoing conversation about how we, as a society, protect the vulnerable, ensure fairness, and hold our guardians to the highest standard. May this story spark the debates, discussions, and positive reforms that keep freedom's flame